Welcome to Tipping Point. I'm Jimmy Evans. Have you ever had questions about the book of Revelation? Many people do, and it's very common for people to have trouble understanding it. It's one of the most important books in the Bible, especially related to understanding end-time prophecy. And today I have an expert on Bible prophecy and the end times with me to talk about his new book that answers 125 questions related to the book of Revelation. Dr. Mark Hitchcock is a regular contributor to endtimes.com and has written 40 books on end-time prophecy. He earned a THM and PhD from Dallas Theological Seminary, where he also serves as a research professor of biblical exposition. Mark is the senior pastor of Faith Bible Church in Edmond, Oklahoma. He's widely respected as one of the most astute end-time prophecy teachers in the world, and he's joining me today to talk about his new book, The Revelation Answer Book, 125 Common Questions People Ask About Earth's Final Days. Mark, thank you for joining me today.
Well, great to be with you as always, Jimmy. Thank you so much for having me on.
Well, I love the fact that you wrote this book, The Revelation Answer Book, 125 Common Questions People Ask About Earth's Final Days. There are a lot of books out there, Q&A books, one that I've written on prophecy in general, but I don't know of one that's out there specifically on the book of Revelation, especially as detailed as you have it here, 125 common questions. So we're going to talk through today about your book. But just to say to people who are watching, first of all, get this book. I'll use this as a reference book forever. I'll use all your books as reference books. But if you have a question about the book of Revelation, you can go in your contents here. Every question is here. Mm-hmm. So a person doesn't have to wade through the whole book to find something specific that they're looking for. If you have a question about the book of Revelation, you can find it here in the table of contents and just turn right to that chapter and get your question answered. But why is the book of Revelation important, Mark? Because we obviously know it's a very well-known book, but it's a hard book for most people to understand. Mm-hmm. Why should people even try to understand it? Why is it so important?
Well, several reasons. Obviously, it's the capstone of God's revelation to us. In the book of Genesis, God tells us how everything got here, how it all got started. And the book of Revelation is the capstone to that. It tells the end of the story. When you think about, reading a mesmerizing novel and you're all caught up in this thing and all of a sudden and there's no last chapter, the thing never gets resolved. It'd be totally frustrating. It's the resolution of everything. There are 404 verses in the book of Revelation. Some people believe there are as many as 550 allusions to the Old Testament in the book of Revelation. Now, there's interesting. There's no direct quotes. There's no direct quotations from the Old Testament in the book of Revelation, but just hundreds of allusions. And someone said years ago that the book of Revelation is like the Grand Central Station of the Bible. It's where all the trains come in. All the trains of thought come in there. And so it's the book that gives us the resolution of everything. It tells us where history's headed, where we're headed, and God's ultimate victory. But I think another just kind of a very practical reason, it's the only book in the Bible that has a blessing attached to those who read it, who hear it, and who understand it and heed and obey what's written in it. So in Revelation chapter 1 and verse 3. So, I call it the blessing book. So there's a blessing, obviously, to just understanding what's there. But I think when people begin to read the book of Revelation, I always tell people when we do a study of the book of Revelation, get ready to be blessed. It's the only book that has that blessing attached to us. So, there's a lot of other reasons to study the book of Revelation. But I'd say those are really the two main reasons I would see for people to really dig into this book and understand it.
So what are the different views you have here in your table of contents, the 5 main views of Revelation? What are the different views?
Well, one thing I was going to mention up front here, just as, thinking about this book that I wrote, one thing I was going to say real quickly is, I don't claim to have all the answers about the book of Revelation, but I've heard all the questions. So, I've taught the book at Dallas Seminary many times, taught it at our church all the way through 2 different times. So that's one thing I was just going to mention to people. I don't profess to have all the answers. I certainly don't profess that, but I do think I know the questions. You got to know the questions before you can get the answers. But yeah, there's some big approaches to the book of Revelation, kind of overarching approaches that people take. Just to kind of give those real quickly, there's what's called the preterist view, and that believes that most or all of the book of Revelation was fulfilled back around 70 AD with the destruction of Jerusalem. So the word preter is just a Latin word that means past. There's what's called the historicist view. Historicists believe that the book of Revelation is kind of being fulfilled between the first and second comings of Jesus. It's kind of being played out in history. There's an idealist view. The idealist view takes it that the symbols in the book don't really refer to things that are concrete. It's just kind of the ongoing struggle between the church and the world really throughout this age. And the futurist view holds that from chapter 4 on is still future even today. And that's the view that you and I hold. And then there's a fifth view, actually, that came about a few years ago, a guy came up with called the eclectic view, where he kind of mashes all four of the other ones together. So there's always somebody that does that, you know. But the eclectic view primarily is idealism. It's idealistic, but it just kind of brings in a few of the other ideas. But just a quick rundown, you know, the problem with the preterist view is, you know, it says the book of Revelation was written in 95 AD, or in 65 AD. It was a prophecy of events in 70 AD. Well, the problem is the book of Revelation was written in 95 AD. And it can't be a prophecy of events in 70 if it was written 25 years later. So that's a huge problem for the preterists. Use just the date of the book. The problem with historicism is, you know, every age when people live, you know, back in the, you know, in the time of the Reformation, they believed the Pope was the Antichrist. And so people kind of just take what's happening in their day and just put that on the book of Revelation. So there's never any real agreement about what these symbols refer to. People just kind of apply it to their own time. The idealistic view, the problem with that is the idealistic view is that they don't really give any meaning to the symbols. When you go to Revelation 1, Jesus, there in chapter 1, there's 7 lampstands, and he has 7 stars in his right hand. And Jesus says those 7 lampstands are 7 churches. So Jesus is giving us there the golden key to how to interpret the book of Revelation. That is that these symbols you see refer to something that's literal. Each one of them do. And then, yeah, the futurist view, I think, is the view that makes the most sense because from chapter 4, certainly chapter 6 on, nothing like that has ever happened in history before. And it makes sense, again, as I said earlier, that, you know, God who started the story and began the story is going to give us the end of the story in the book of Revelation. So, you know, I come at the book from a futurist position. I think that's the one. And really, and you go back to the very earliest church fathers, they all held the futurist view of the book.
Yeah. So I want to just kind of talk through the book of Revelation to kind of give people who are watching right now and listening right now just kind of an overview of Revelation. But first of all, I want to ask you, Mark, do you believe that the book of Revelation is chronological? This is a question we get a lot, and that is, as you're reading through the book, because you and I both have a futurist view, and so beginning with chapter 4, we believe that's where the rapture occurs. Mm-hmm. That's where, you know, the church is caught up, and from that point forward, we get into the seal judgments, the trumpet judgments, the bowl judgments, all of that, the second coming, everything. Generally, do you believe it's chronological?
I do. Yeah, I see it as sequential. Yeah, a lot of people take it, you know, you go through and then you kind of go back and you go through it again, you kind of go back again. It's called recapitulation. You're just kind of doing the same thing. But what I do see is the movement of the book, I think, is in the seals and the trumpets and the bowls. And then in between those, there's these little parentheses, I call them, kind of intermissions, where you kind of were filled in on kind of some things that are happening during that period of time. But the seals, the trumpets, the bowls, I think move sequentially because they don't recapitulate because they're different. And also when you get to the bowls, it says it's finished. This is the last plague. Well, if it's the last, then the idea is that this has been a sequence that's been unfolding. And also in the book of Revelation, really, you have in Matthew 24, the sermon Jesus gave on Wednesday before he died on Friday. That's often called, Matthew 24 is called the little apocalypse, kind of the mini apocalypse, kind of the Reader's Digest condensed version of the book of Revelation. And if you read Matthew 24, it is sequential. You know, and so if Matthew 24 is sequential and the book of Revelation is just kind of an expansion of that, then we would believe that it's sequential again. But again, you have these pauses along the way that kind of fill in some detail for us, some background. But overall, yeah, the book's moving through sequence from the rapture all the way to the recreation of the new heaven and new earth.
So chapter 1, the book of Revelation is the revelation of Jesus Christ. And so the revelation that we have is in chapter 1, Jesus in his eternal state. Mm-hmm. This is a picture we don't get earlier in the Bible of, you know, the glorious Son of God. And so just kind of encapsulate what is most important about chapter 1.
Well, yeah, in chapter 1, you have where there's an introduction there in the first verses there, the first 8 verses, kind of a introduction to the book. And then you have a vision John has. John's on the island of Patmos off the coast, about 50 miles off the coast of Ephesus. He's exiled there. And John has a vision of the radiant resurrected Christ. He's there, and he's on the Lord's Day. I think it's on a Sunday. He's probably up in that cave that maybe you and I visited on Patmos, and he's looking back towards the churches there. He's praying, and the radiant resurrected Christ appears to him. And Jesus, when he appears, he's in the middle of 7 lampstands, which we find out later are these 7 churches. And I love that Jesus is right in the middle of them. He needs to be right in the middle of what's going on with the church. And he's got 7 stars in his right hand. And the 7 stars are the 7 angels of those 7 churches, which I take it are the leaders there. We could call it the pastor, the lead pastor of those churches, which is another very comforting thought that the Lord has his leaders of his churches in his hand. And so John sees this vision of the radiant resurrected Christ there in chapter 1. And then Jesus goes on there then and is going to give John 7 messages to these 7 churches. And that's what you have in chapters 2 and 3. But, John, when he sees, think about John was the disciple Jesus loved. He had his, head on Jesus' breast, his chest at the Last Supper. And when he sees Jesus there, it says he fell down on his face like a dead man. And that's the power of Jesus' appearance for him. So chapter 1 is John is writing down what he's just seen. He's just seen this vision of the radiant resurrected Savior.
So chapters 2 and 3 are the letters to the 7 churches, which are all very important. Now, there are different ways that people look at this. The theologians look at chapters 2 and 3. One is sequential, is that you have the church of Ephesus being the early church, and the church at Laodicea being the last days church. Okay. Another view that I believe you hold is they just represent churches of all ages. I mean, there's not necessarily one church that represents an age. It's those 7 churches represent the church in all of its different states through the ages. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah. What I like to say is the 7 churches there's a practical, obviously, interpretation of those. They were written to 7 literal churches at that time that needed the information he gave them. But then there's I call it a perennial significance, that there's 7 of them, the number of completion, because they kind of represent the kinds of churches that will always be present on the earth. So there's always these kinds of churches. And then, like you said, some people see a prophetic significance that they represent kind of 7 stages of church history. The problem with that to me is that the text never says that. And the other problem is, it's kind of just looking at it from a Western viewpoint. We would say today, well, we're in the Laodicean stage, we're rich and have need of nothing and self-sufficient and all that. We'll go tell that to believers in Haiti or Cambodia or North Korea. So, in other words, that only fits kind of a Western view of the church. It doesn't fit the church as a whole. So I don't see that as, 7 stages of church history that are unfolding. It preaches well, but I'm not really sure that that's what was the original intent of the author.